In the lead up to the First World War, global trade was at the highest it had ever been. Early 1900s trade data is super hard to come by, especially for underdeveloped countries, but researchers estimate that global exports had reached almost $275 billion by 1913. That was almost 15% of global economic output at that time. So it really begs the question, why didn't trade lead to world peace? You see, in 1910, a former cowboy turned journalist published The Great Illusion, where he essentially argued that trade had become so ubiquitous as to make war highly unlikely. His ideas were incredibly popular, even in the face of worsening diplomatic relations among European states. But it took one Bosnian Serb to put a hole in his idealistic philosophy, and Archduke Franz Ferdinand's throat. The assassination triggered a cascade of defense treaties that would pull the world into its deadliest military conflict to date. A war which many citizens thought would take several months ended almost half a decade later with the deaths of tens of millions of people. After the war, countries understandably became more reluctant to have their borders infiltrated. Businesses that wanted to send their goods across states had to contend with a Europe that was markedly different from the Europe that had existed in 1913. For instance, there were new borders which made international travel more onerous, the rise of the Soviet Union which exported an autarkic economic system, and trade costs which were becoming increasingly prohibitive since the end of World War I. By 1939, total trade, that is, imports plus exports, were now a smaller share of global economic output than just global exports were in 1913. Now, depending on one's outlook, this plummet in trade relations could have been either good or bad. If complex supply chains hadn't restrained nation-states in 1914, perhaps isolationism would give everyone the idea to just leave each other alone. We know now the result of that experiment. By 1945, World War II had killed up to 60 million people, making it the world's deadliest war. It's unsurprising that people were beginning to wonder if trade really mattered at all, at least in terms of international conflict. And it's a fair question to ask. If trade is either instigating conflicts, deterring conflicts elsewhere, or has no relation to world peace, then that's helpful information to know. Fortunately, researchers have spent a lot of time investigating this very question, and a clear consensus has emerged. First, trade matters. Second, trade can be a pacifying force, but only under certain conditions. And finally, when these conditions are not met, trade can make war more probable. Today, we are witnessing some of the worst interstate conflicts that many of us have seen in a very long time. And so, we need to promote policies on the global stage to make such incidents less likely. Trade won't prevent all wars, but requiring any policy to deal in absolutes is to invite anxiety among academics and inertia among policymakers. The idea that extensive trade routes might deter war has as long of a history as the idea that extensive trade routes might encourage war. According to Jacob Viner, a Canadian economist, optimism about the mutual benefits of trade can be found in many ancient Greek and Roman literature. Christian theologians then gave this optimism a religious expression, arguing that God had blessed nation-states with different endowments to incentivize a world connected by vast supply chains. But not everyone at the time was convinced. Catherine Barbieri writes that many Greek and Roman philosophers, including Plato and Aristotle, worried that trade might create a codependency that could damage a state's self-sufficiency. In fact, the positive image of traders only arose in the Middle Ages. It would take 2 world wars before social scientists grabbed the baton from philosophers to mount serious scholarship on the relationship between conflict and trade in the 1980s. These studies generated very heated debate until 2 schools of thought came to dominate the literature. On one side were the commercial liberals who argued that trade enhanced the welfare of all trading partners, and because states seek to maximize welfare, it would be irrational for them to behave in such a way as to jeopardize those trade routes. Sure, international politics is inherently chaotic, but states acting in their own self-interest can and often will lead to cooperative behavior. The liberal theory seemed plausible, but it did have a World War I-sized hole. 1913 was marked by trade liberation, not by trade protectionism, and yet it still led to the deadliest war at that time. Realists had an entirely different view of the state than did the commercial liberals. Whereas the latter assumed that states maximize social welfare, realists assumed that states maximize national security. Economic welfare is subordinate to national security risks. Realists saw trade as a necessary but dangerous practice. It's necessary because, as economies grow, businesses need a larger market in which to sell their goods. This is where trade can be helpful. It gives domestic firms access to international markets. But trade is also dangerous because it incentivizes specialization, whereby one state depends on another state for strategic resources. If the less dependent state were to cut its trade flows, then the more dependent state will lose access to their strategic resources and incur costs from specializing in a good which the less dependent state will now refuse to purchase. Also, not everyone benefits equally in trade. If one state is benefiting more from a trade agreement than another, then the less benefited state may worry that their trading partner is becoming too powerful. Asymmetric benefits and a lack of self-dependency may be good enough reasons for the state which depends more on trade to capture its former trading partner's resources through military force. The United States and China are a great example of two countries who trade extensively with each other but don't seem to get along very well. In 2022, China purchased $150 billion worth of US exports at the same time that the US purchased over $500 billion worth of Chinese exports, making China the largest supplier of goods to the United States. But during the Trump presidency, the administration imposed tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese goods. The Biden administration continued a lot of the tariffs that were placed during the Trump presidency and added many of their own. These trade wars don't contradict the liberal argument outright, but it does show that extensive trade routes can still lead to a conflictual relationship. Some realists also believe that trade could be completely unrelated to military conflict. The fact that World War I and World War II occurred, despite being predated by nearly opposite levels of economic interdependence, makes sense if nation-states care more about national security than about economic welfare. It was only until the 2000s when scholars agreed that perhaps both camps had a point. Analysts could find examples where trade seemed to deter conflict, but they could also find many examples where extensive trade routes precipitated conflict. And so the question went from, does trade deter military conflict, to, under what conditions can trade deter military conflict? In 2008, two political scientists at Duke University became one of the first researchers to answer the latter question. Using the same data as commercial liberals and realists, they were able to reproduce the commercial liberal argument that trade decreases the risk of war, and the realist argument that trade has no effect on the risk of war. The authors then add a variable which captures extensive trade between trading partners and the level of democracy of those trading partners. After including this variable, they find that trade does increase the likelihood of military conflict, but only for non-democratic states. So, trade between democratic states has a pacifying effect. It's possible that democratic leaders are more sensitive to the demands of their populace who are hurt most from war. It's why many of the sanctions imposed on Russia target Russian elites, who may hold more sway over Russia's political leaders than do the general population. Other studies have found that trade is pacifying only between high-income countries since they have the most to gain and to lose from international trade. Otherwise, trade leads to more military conflict. So it seems that both the commercial liberals and realists are correct. By itself, trade does create security issues which lead to war. But conditional on some other variable, such as the trading partner's wealth or its democratic level, trade can have a pacifying effect. But even these results have a non-trivial problem. Realism seems to be correct at least for non-democratic states. But why? Why would authoritarian states care more about national security issues than democratic states, who seemingly care more about social welfare? Maybe it's not democracy or even economic development that matters, but something else entirely. Most of the literature on trade and conflict miss two crucial elements. First, the assumption that realists and liberals make in their arguments is that trade is conducted between countries with different resources. For example, one state might have vast oil fields, whereas another state can produce high-quality computer chips. For the realists, security concerns arise because a state becomes dependent on exports which it either can't produce itself or can't produce without great cost. This is a very classical view of trade and is the kind of trade that students will learn about in introductory economics courses. In practice, though, a lot of trade is conducted between countries with very similar endowments. In 2022, the United States exported over $57 billion worth of cars. At the same time, it imported $159 billion worth of cars. Economists call this intra-industry trade, which is when countries trade goods that are in the same industry. To be clear, it's not that countries are trading identical goods. Instead, firms specialize within their industry. So while the United States and Germany both trade cars, The United States will export Fords, but Germany will export Volkswagens. This benefits consumers in both countries because they are presented with a wider variety of cars to purchase, and car manufacturers must compete against other car manufacturers, which means that Ford will need to produce higher quality pickup trucks, and Volkswagens will have to make better SUVs. Since 1962, intra-industry trade has become a larger share of global trade. According to one study, intra-industry trade increased from 10 billion US dollars in 1962 to more than 3 trillion US dollars in 2010. At the same time, inter-industry trade increased from 84 US billion dollars to more than 9 trillion US dollars. Most of the increase in intra-industry trade is driven by trade between high-income countries who are also the most important players in international politics. The same study mentioned above finds that intra-industry trade is negatively related to the likelihood of military disputes, even after controlling for the extent of trade and the democratic level of trading partners. Jointly democratic trading partners are also more likely to be high-income countries, which are the ones who conduct most intra-industry trade today. So it might not have been democracy that was creating the pacifying influence, as suggested by earlier research, but instead the depth of intra-industry trade. Countries that engage in intra-industry trade will have very similar endowments, meaning that they don't become dependent on each other for strategic commodities. Germany's ability to manufacture passenger vehicles won't threaten the United States, who can also manufacture passenger vehicles. At the same time, war will disrupt the variety of goods, representing a net loss to consumers in both countries because they now have fewer kinds of passenger vehicles to choose from at a higher price. And it's not like trading partners can easily find other countries which supply that differentiated product. Inter-industry trade is usually trade in very homogeneous commodities, like oil or grain. Oil from Iran is not very different from oil from Canada or oil from Venezuela. So if trade between any one of those countries is suddenly disrupted, it would be relatively easy to get that resource from a different country. Intra-industry trade is different. Cars from Japan are not the same as cars from Brazil or cars from Argentina. If one were to cut off trade with Japan, it would be very challenging to find cars of a similar quality from other countries. This makes intra-industry trade a potentially greater deterrent against war because it would be very difficult for the aggressor to find alternative goods if trade was ever disrupted. According to a 2017 paper published in the British Journal of Political Science, the lack of intra-industry trade in 1913 might explain why the global conflict occurred in the following year. Global trade fell immediately when the war broke out, but instead of staying at a small level, it rose quickly until it almost reached its pre-war peak before crashing once again in the final year of the war. Trade fell when the war broke out because exchange between warring states effectively went to zero at the start of the war, but countries were able to quickly reroute trade networks so that those within their alliance became their primary trading partners. This created some efficiency costs as countries had to purchase goods from alliance members instead of their former trading partners. But because tradable goods in 1913 were principally homogeneous, the efficiency costs incurred from substituting away from former trading partners was small. So, trade wasn't the great deterrent to war that scholars previously thought. We are seeing a very similar process with Russia's trading networks. In 2021, Russia was a significant energy supplier to the European Union. Since the war, trade between Russia and the EU has dropped to more than half of its pre-war levels. China is now Russia's most important trading partner, providing roughly half of Russia's imports. Russia has also redirected its energy exports from Europe to China and Turkey, as well as to India, Africa, and the Middle East. Because Russia could substitute away from European trading networks, its linkages to Europe were a poor deterrent against war with Ukraine. The second element that's missing from most of the literature is considerations about the expectations of future trade flows. The assumption that commercial liberals and realists make is that political leaders will look at trade flows in the previous period to determine if they should declare war or not in the current period. But this is an incomplete picture of how people usually make decisions. When someone decides what to do today, they're going to consider what has happened in the past and what they expect to happen in the future. If there's extensive trade today, but political leaders expect trade flows to be disrupted, it could be in their interest to invade their former trading partner to obtain those resources. This means that war can start even in the face of extensive trade flows. But it also means that economic isolationism can still be a deterrent to war if political leaders expect there to be high trade flows in the future. Expectations of future trade flows will be some functions of trade today, but it will also be a function of certain signals. A signal is either a verbal or nonverbal communication from one state to another that indicates the future willingness to trade on the part of the state sending that signal. Signals that indicate worsening trade expectations may be partly to blame for Germany's decision to choose war in July 1914 and August 1939. The German political establishment sought to expand trade to Europe and the United States, but were met with opposition, specifically from the US and France, who placed tariffs on German goods. Great Britain had also made overtures to create an imperial preference system which would discriminate against German products. At the same time, Germans were becoming increasingly dependent on trade for crucial commodities in the decade before the war. So, in 1914, German declaration of war was at least partly the result of its negative trade expectations, which it had formed from signals sent to it from the great powers of the time. We saw similarly dire trade expectations on the German part in the lead up to World War II. When the great powers started moving towards protectionism in the 1930s, worries about self-sufficiency became rampant in the German political class. In August of 1936, Hitler wrote, "We are overpopulated and cannot feed ourselves from our own resources. It is equally impossible for us at present to manufacture artificially certain raw materials which we lack in Germany or to find substitutes for them." Since then, Hitler went to great lengths to make Germany more self-sufficient, but Germany was still reliant on outsiders for resources even up to the eve of the war. And while it's impossible to reduce Germany's decision to declare war in 1936 to a single variable, Germany's insecure economic position was a significant factor. The fact is that the world is messy, and states start wars over a variety of reasons. However, the research is clear that states do consider international trade when weighing the pros and cons of military conflict. Commercial liberals believed that supply chains had created global peace until the First World War trounced that hope. Since then, researchers have come to an understanding of the trade-conflict relationship that is more realistic and, as a result, more nuanced. Trade can have a pacifying effect, but only under two conditions. First, intra-industry trade must be a non-trivial share of the total trade between two states. Otherwise, states can substitute away from former trading partners at low cost, making it more likely that the benefits of war will outweigh the costs. Second, signaling between states should be clear and positive. Extensive trade flows won't be a deterrent against war if future trade expectations are negative. Policies that favor trade liberalization can signal to trading partners that they should expect continued trade relations even when administrations change. It's tempting to look at conflicts today and want to retreat to our own borders. But this is a time when we should have more trade, not less. And it should be more of the right kind of trade, not the kind which makes one country wholly dependent on another. Honestly, I do think that this is a subtlety that's going to be very challenging to capture, especially in today's fraught political climate. But when the benefits are saved lives, well, from my perspective, it's a benefit worth pursuing.